My name is Mike Elgin, and this is my Food and Technology podcast number 23. My guest this week is author and journalist David Sachs. Here comes the FATcast. Now that everything's digital, connected, automated, and efficient, what are we missing from the analog world? My guest today wrote an entire book called The Revenge of Analog: Real Things and Why They Matter. Here's my conversation with David Sachs. Thank you so much for coming on the FATcast. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm also a fan of, well, we'll get to what else I'm a fan of. I discovered in preparing for this interview that, in fact, you wrote one of my favorite articles ever, but we'll get to that. Now, your most recent book, The Revenge of Analog: Real Things and Why They Matter, really struck a chord with me because I love physical things, especially physical books and newspapers. Absolutely love them. Of course, digital media are, so much cheaper. They're more practical. They're more useful. They're supposed to be better for the environment. So why do we love physical things?
Well, I think fundamentally because we're physical creatures, right? We still interact with the world sort of at its most richest and rewarding when we're able to touch and feel and smell and pick things up. And while the convenience that you mentioned of all sorts of sort of digital information and goods and ideas is kind of its main advantage, I think we underestimated just how much the sort of tactile functions of analog experiences meant to us.
It's kind of really interesting. I cover social media, and one of the big trends now is fake news on social media, and everybody's in a panic about it. Facebook is freaking out, trying to figure out how they can change their algorithms so that people aren't spreading false news. Nobody knows what's true anymore. We're entering post-truth politics because of fake news and because it's digital and being passed around on social media. And it seems to me that the solution is for people to simply subscribe to reputable physical newspapers and magazines. Try to cross this political spectrum, maybe a left-wing publication, maybe a right-wing publication, and just read on paper. Like, it seems like we had solved this problem, and now we have created a problem for ourselves out of nowhere for no reason. Why do you think there's societal pressure to dismiss physical news media as antiquated?
Well, first of all, I think that, look, you can have fake news and propaganda in the analog world. The Der Stürmer, which was the Nazi Party paper, and the Dearborn Independent, which was the virulent, anti-Semitic paper of funded by Henry Ford, the Breitbart of its day. Yeah. Those were paper publications. I think the difference is, paper has a cost, right? Publishing something has a cost. It requires a bit of a machine behind it of editors and fact checkers. And so there is a sort of a minimum standard that clears a certain hurdle. It doesn't mean you can't have lies and half-truths and falsehoods and propaganda in paper. It's just somewhat more difficult. And especially now when, the paper publications are sort of almost seen as a luxury or choice, those who are choosing them are doing so, electing that sort of quality. But, there is sort of fundamentally this idea of economics, right? And it's this, I think, somewhat false notion that, the main, problem of print is the paper itself, and if you get rid of that, then the business makes sense. But what you've seen is that so many publications have sort of followed that path and put all their articles online for free. And it's not like the riches have then come to them. If anything, they've created more problems. They've given away their product without actually replacing it with any revenue. So I think, what you're seeing now is this kind of shaking out between, the promise of digital publication, which hasn't necessarily come to fruition in terms of, you can publish anything online, you can send it around, but you still, very few people know how to actually make money off that. The resilience of a lot of paper media, which, may be declining in readership and obviously in ad dollars, but still has a value there. And if anything, that value is now greater because it is a mark of quality. So even if you subscribe to the New York Times online, as I do, I don't subscribe to the paper edition or the Washington Post. There is like a notion of quality because it also is something that's tied to a physical product, right?
Yeah.
And as someone who's a journalist for print magazines and newspapers sometimes, I know that what that means in terms of the back end of how the stories are made, right? There is a greater accountability in terms of effort that the editors go through to make sure something is good and consistent and adheres to a certain standards of fact. That whenever I write for an online publication just isn't the same because it costs less. The idea is to get it out quicker, to do more of it. And so that has an impact, I think, on the quality of the information that's there. The medium is the message in some way.
One of the things I like about physical newspapers over the digital is linearity. When I go to the New York Times website, they're trying to cram all the different sections and the top stories for each of the sections, and they're also promoting their weekly magazine, and there's all this stuff all over the page, and my eyes sort of glance over it, and I'm like, well, I want to read this story, and then I want to read that story, and I'm just automatically creating a filter bubble. Whereas when I have the physical paper, I start on the front page and I go through and I consider every article in order. I don't read them all, but I see them. I see the headline and maybe the deck and maybe skim the lead, and even if it's something that I don't necessarily care about, other than the sports section, which I just throw away immediately, I still get a sense of it. I still am exposed to the fact that this stuff is happening. They cover stuff in African countries or Pacific islands that I, just never penetrate the mainstream consciousness of people who are reading online and using filter bubbles. And so the linearity of physical media, I think, is one of its powers.
Yeah, there was an editor at the managing editor of The Economist that I interviewed for the book. His name's Tom Standage. And when we were talking in London, he said, what we sell at The Economist, which is, my subscription costs like close to $200 Canadian a year.
Pricey.
I rarely get through an eighth of each issue because it comes every week. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm going through, I'm seeing what I want to read. But what he sells is finishability, which is that you can never finish the internet. There's always the next thing. There's always the next article. The New York Times is constantly refreshing its feed to show, the latest and the greatest. And that's a great advantage. But, there is something to that contained experience. And in some ways, as you're saying, it does make you read things that you wouldn't normally read. I just finished an Economist article from a while ago. It was, in my bathroom where The Economist lives. And, it was about, a border town, the tale of two border cities between North Korea and China, and how, one has evolved and the other hasn't. And it was just fascinating in the way it was told. Again, that's not something that I would ever click on The Economist website or the website of the New York Times, and certainly would never appear in a news feed I have because, it didn't relate to the previous story I read, and that's the only way, you get that feedback loop. But I think, that is what people look for, and that's why, people still subscribe to the New York Review of Books and still subscribe to the New Yorker and other magazines and newspapers, especially Sunday papers, because they're looking for that sort of immersive experience of saying, okay, I don't want to have to pick and choose, just present it to me. Tell me what I should be listening to, right? What I should be caring about. Whereas I think a couple of years ago, there was this great promise of, we're going to give you only what you're interested in. And I think now we're seeing both from the perspective of readers and media consumers, right? It's like, okay, well, now I'm just getting a lot of the same, whether it's on the app of Spotify or on Netflix, right? Like it's garbage in, garbage out. But in the other sense is, the political consequences of that, the societal consequences of only being shown the same thing again that you see in the mirror over and over, has, real world consequences.
Now I'm Gen X, I guess, and I grew up with vinyl records and Polaroid cameras and other media objects that millennial hipsters now seek out of a sense of nostalgia. what's bizarre to me is why is it that they are nostalgic for my past as opposed to their own?
First of all, I wouldn't necessarily say they are seeking it out of a sense of nostalgia. Nostalgia certainly plays a part in it, and that depends on the individual and the technology. But in many ways, these are people who are adopting these